אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו לעסוק בדברי תורה. ברב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודע שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני מלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בך בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Okay, so what we're going to do is this particular shir, there seems to be a lot of people our age at the moment that are going through a very difficult time. One of the ones is Evan Noak's wife, Laura. So we're doing the shir in her refuah. Her name is Shulamit Bat Batya. And she's undergoing chemotherapy at the moment for cancer. And please God, may she make a full recovery.
Amen.
Yeah, amen.
Tomorrow we obviously doing a share for another friend of ours that is undergoing chemotherapy. I don't know if we're just getting to that age bracket now, or that there's something very toxic about our lifestyle and our foods. I'm not sure, but I hope everybody
Probably
makes
the latter.
Probably the latter. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the Mishnah Brura 193 and the Shulchan Aruch 193 by Rabbi Daniel Brody. So we're discussing not splitting up from a zimun. So a zimun is obviously where there are more than three males that bench together. So once three or even more men eaten bread together, obviously it's a minimum of three, they're obligated in a zimun and are not allowed to split up benching separately. Okay, that's in the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Brura. If they were six or more, they could split up actually then into two groups of three, so that no one would lose the zimun that they're already obligated to. So if, like, for example, the first three have to leave urgently, and the other three have got more of a relaxed pace, they can split it up according to their time pressure. But if they're 10 or more, they have even a stronger obligation. So the words are obviously there's special words added to the zimun the minute there are 10 people which add Hashem's name, and they cannot split up. If there are 20 or more, they can split up into two groups of 10. So there is one leniency to split up. At a big meal, if they won't hear the leader of the zimun and they cannot separate into groups of 10 for some reason, they can split into small groups of three. So this includes if they have to go and do another Torah mitzvah, or the leader would be offended if he hears them doing a big zimun of 10 by themselves. From here, we see that it's important to hear the whole zimun until Hazanet HaKol, and accordingly, the one leading should ideally be the person with the loud voice. Okay. So all it's saying there, bottom line, is if you can't hear the leader correctly, then you're not participating actively in the zimun of 10 or more. So then in that case, you might well break up into three groups of three. So it's imperative that you be able to answer as in the responser of the lead of the person giving the shir. Now, let's go to the Gemara 23b3. And what we did yesterday is we obviously discussed the Mishnah. I'm just going to quickly open up the screen again. I'll be 1 second. Allow us to capture it. Give me a second, guys. Now, in appreciation for Gavin, that's never missed a shir, to let us know that it's appreciated. Gavin, would you do the honor of reading the Mishnah?
On my phone, this is tricky. Give me 1 second.
Okay. All right.
I've got to put it into landscape as I can't see a thing.
All right.
Okay, I've got it in landscape.
Okay. So we are
okay. Let's go. Yeah. Okay, the Mishnah now proceeds to explain the case of muad ox mentioned in the Mishnah on 15b. Which animal is tam and which is muad? A muad is any animal that they have testified about what it has done on 3 separate days, and it reverts to being a tam when it desists from such behavior on 3 separate days. Interesting. These are the words of our Yehudah. Our Meir says a muad is an animal that they have testified about what it has done 3 times, and it reverts to being a tam any time that children poke it between the horns and it does not gore.
Excellent, excellent. Well
Thanks,
read, Gabe. So, all right. So, bottom line, you can see from the Mishnah, just the superficial reading, is that Rav Yehudah states that the exact same way that an animal became muad is the way that it reverts to be back into a state of tameness. So, obviously, in order to become forewarned, on the 4th occurrence is when full payment damages from choice property occur, instead of half payment damages from the gufa of the animal, from the body of the animal. So it has to be, Rav Yehudah said, it has to have done this transgression on 3 separate days. Because as Kevin asked yesterday, is it 3 times or is it 3 days? So Rav Yehudah states that an incident that occurs on 3 separate days basically inculcates a habit far more than 3 times on a single day. So in order for it to become tame again, or tam, it has to desist from that behavior in the exact same manner at which it became muad. In other words, in 3 separate days, when tested, it's not that the animal doesn't react on 3 separate days. It's that when it's put exactly in the same situation, in other words, it's provoked in the same manners that it was recorded to be provoked and reacted badly. When tested again on 3 separate days, it is then seen not to behave badly when tested with the same sort of aggravation by another animal. Okay? Now, I'm not saying, Gavin asked a good question yesterday. Nobody's deciding here, even according to Rav Meir, that you put children in harm's way or put animals there to test it. Again, what we're doing is when we're studying the Mishnah and the Gemara, what we're talking about here, specifically with this one, is a term of concepts. This is what would be considered to make the animal go back to a state of tame and calmness. Does that make sense? Nobody's suggesting you test your kids with these animals, but they're saying if there are witnesses and you happen to notice that children poke it between the horns in order to tease and aggravate it and it doesn't react, according to Rabbi Meir, it reverts to being tam. Nobody's suggesting that you put children in that spot at all. The second thing of it is Rav Meir does agree that an animal does become muad after 3 times of it creating that particular habitual damaging act. However, in order for that animal to revert to being tam, Rabbi Meir says that it would seem to be 1 time that it would revert back to being tame if it stopped from that sort of aggressive behavior. What we learned yesterday very clearly was Rashi disputed on one particular level, and he said if children poke it in the horns, it's got no reason to assume that the animal is in fact tame, because human beings have divine protection, and therefore Hashem could calm the nature of the animal down specifically because he doesn't want a human being to be hurt in that particular case. So that's no indication. However, if an animal aggravated it that 1 time and the animal that was the aggressor was calm, then that would be a clearer indication, but not necessarily of a human being. Others don't agree with Rashi, I think as far as I'm not Tosfot, which basically states that it says in Perush HaMishnah, Rabbeinu Yonasan specifically says Rabbi Meir means that the bull that does not cause children who are poking at it, an animal that's docile will certainly not harm other animals if children are aggravating it. So he doesn't agree. So as far as that's concerned, Rabbi Meir is teaching us how a muad can lose that status by basically exhibiting docile behavior even one time. So that's the primary difference. He agrees, however, obviously with the Tana Kamma. So the Tana Kamma in this case is Rav Yehudah, that it can also revert to being tam by desisting from its former behavior. In other words, goring other oxen on 3 separate days, because that's obvious. If I'm turning around to you and saying after one incident, the animal can revert to being tame, if my dissenting opinion is saying after 3 times it's becoming tame from desisting from that behavior, so obviously I agree. If I agree for 1 time, even more so for 3 times, it's become calm. So he doesn't disagree with them there. Obviously, Rav Yehudah disagrees with Rav Meir because he seems to say it needs to be on 3 separate days. Okay, so we're going to actually go into the Gemara now that we finished the Mishnah. It says the Gemara explains the rationale of each Tana of the Mishnah. So what is Rav Yehudah's reason for ruling that 3 days are needed to establish an animal as muad? Okay, so what's Rav Yehudah's reason that you need 3 days? And we talk about 3 separate days to establish an animal as muad. So there's a verse in Shmot, which is Exodus chapter 21, verse 36. And it's defined as follows. If it became known that it was a goring bull from yesterday and before yesterday, yet its owner did not guard it, okay? And Abaye now shows how Rav Yehudah derives his ruling from the verse. So if we say, Abaye said, for the verse states yesterday, which gives us 1 day, okay? So I just want to explain to you what the logic is. If I say to you, I stopped eating, say it's the 9 days of Av, okay? And I say I've stopped eating meat from yesterday. How do you count that, guys? If I say to you, I've stopped eating meat from yesterday, how can you count that as 1 day? The answer is
no. I think you
Depends
counted
on
from
what
the night
time.
before.
Yeah.
okay. Good point. So Mark was making a good point. Is that Marco said that if we say from yesterday, technically, we would have to say from 24 hours before. Because even if it's the, or at least, I think when Marco says the night
before.
The night before. So it's one halachic
Or when the day
before.
starts. The day
Correct.
starts, yeah.
Correct. So even Abaye would agree with you that when we say from yesterday, we're talking about a halachic day has transpired. So that's that for sure. So yesterday, which gives us 1 day, and then if we look at the word mitmor terei, which means from yesterday, okay, from that point, it gives us 2 days. Because let me just tell you why the logic is. If I say to you, let's just assume I spend the whole day and I meet you guys at shul at Mincha, and we're about to do Mincha and Mariv. And I saw you last night at Mariv. Okay, that was the last time I saw you. And I used the word today. That means a full day, logically, because we're about to go into Mariv. If I say, so that's 1 day. If I say from yesterday, that extra word from, meaning including the entire part of yesterday, that's 2 days. So today is 1 day, and from yesterday is considered halachically 2 days. If I say yesterday, it could be that only a single day might have transpired. Does that make sense? So that's how the Gemara gets 2 days. Because they say that the word from is not an extraneous word. It says the Torah could have written simply tomorrow, yesterday, instead of mitmor, from yesterday. We interpret the latter form of expression as indicating not 1, but 2 days. Okay. And it says before yesterday gives us 3 days. So what we're trying to determine from this verse is how that verse in Exodus accounts for the number of days at which an animal has to remain in a state at which it becomes muad. In other words, from a calm state to where it's known as an habitual gora. So according to Rav Yehudah, the same reasons that caused its nature to go rogue and become a habitual gorer has to be repeated under the same testing circumstances in order that it now reverts back to its tame state. So it says, but if it became known that it was a goring bull from yesterday and before yesterday, yet its owner did not guard it. So what we're saying is if it said from, the word from yesterday and before yesterday, we're implying 3 days in total. Okay, so that's where we get our 3 days from. When the verse then states and its owner did not guard it, we come to the 4th goring. So we're saying those are the 3 warnings that we're given for 3 separate days of incidents. And on the 4th day, only on the 4th day it becomes eligible for full payment for goring. Okay. So if an animal then gores a 4th time, its owner is liable to pay full damages from choice property for that 4th occurrence. For the 3rd occurrence, however, the owner still only pays half damage from the gufar of the animal. That's according to Rashi. Thus, an animal that is thus gored on 3 separate days becomes a muad, and the owner makes full restitution for any subsequent gorings, which would be the 4th occurrence. Okay. So there's a different interpretation from the verse. The first interpretation was from Abaye, explaining Rabbi Yehudah. The second interpretation is from Rava. And Rava says that Rabbi Yehudah interprets this as follows. Yesterday, from yesterday is 1 day. He's saying just because it adds the word from doesn't extend the period of time at all. Because we use that phrase from yesterday. So that only implies 1 day. Before yesterday gives us 2 days. And the verse then continues to say that if its owner does not guard it today, and on the 3rd day, he's liable to pay full damages. Okay. So what can we see from Rava guys compared to Abaye? Can you guys give it back to me?
Yeah,
So he's
it's
not
1 day
going to
quicker.
the whole.
Yeah, what did you say? You started first?
Is it from what I heard? And I'm a bit tired, but I think I heard that it's 1 day quicker.
Yes, that's correct. So Abaye interprets the verse as adding the word from yesterday, meaning 2 days. If we said yesterday, it's just 1 day. And then from before yesterday would be the 3rd day if we're including today. So obviously that word from is significant to Abaye when he's interpreting the verse in the Chumash, at which he says Rav Yehudah is denoting 3 separate days at which an animal becomes muad. But Rava doesn't use the word from to interpret it as a full day. So when he uses the term from yesterday, he counts from yesterday to today as 1 day. Okay, and then he said from before yesterday as the 2nd day. So on the 3rd time, the animal becomes muad, not on the 4th occurrence, according to Rava. Does that make sense? That's the primary difference on how they're interpreting the verse of the Chumash and Rav Yehudah. Make sense?
Yeah, that's what I picked up. Yeah, thanks.
In other words, Rava is seeing no significance in the word from yesterday, whereas Abaye is seeing that as significant. Okay. All right. So according, all right. Now Tosfot has got a disagreement with this because Tosfot objects forcefully to Rashi's interpretation of Rava's view. So according to Tosfot, Rava agrees that Rav Yehudah does not consider the animal to be muad until after the 3rd goring. And there's no practical difference from Abaye's exposition to Rava's. Rather, they differ only academically in regard to how we interpret the verse. Okay? According to Abaye, and its owner does not guard, it describes the goring for which the owner pays full damages. In other words, the 4th goring. And according to Rava, it describes the goring that establishes the animal as a muad. In other words, the 3rd goring. And the verse means that the owner will pay 4th damages if the animal then gores again, a 4th time. So Rashi even asserts that, Tosfot even asserts that Rashi himself, in a responsum, actually retracted the explanation he presented here. So I just wanted to bring you a commentary on the commentary. So on all practical differences, Tosfot is saying no. They're both saying that there's no difference. When it uses the word from yesterday or yesterday, we have 3 separate days. And even if you interpret it as 2 days of 2 separate occurrences, it wouldn't make a practical difference the way Rashi interpreted it, because it would have to do 3 offenses, and on the 4th offense, so we either, according to Rava, warn on the 3 offenses, which means the 4th offense you're liable, or state, according to Abaye, that it's 3 separate offenses at which it's implied that the 4th you're obligated. So the only difference here is Rashi. Rashi sees the practical difference as the word from yesterday, implying 3 days according to Abaye. And according to Rava, the word from has no significance, and it's 2 separate days, which means on the 3rd day, the animal is warned after the 2nd time, and on the 3rd day becomes subject to full payment. So there's the difference between Rashi and Tosfot. Okay, but for all practical purposes, let's go on. All right, just give me 1 sec, guys. All right, so the Gemara now explains Rav Meir's rationale. Okay, Rav Meir said, what is his reason that ruling 3 occurrences on even one day makes an animal muat? For it was taught in the Brisa, Rabbi Meir said, if where a bull spreads its goring 3 times over 3 days, its owner is liable to the full damages of muat. Then when it is concentrated, its gorings into 1 day, is it not certain that it is liable for full damages? So what's happening here is Rabbi Meir is actually making a kol v'chomer. Guys, can you see how the kol v'chomer works? What Rabbi Meir is saying is as follows. If Rav Yehudah is saying on 3 separate days the animal is gored, and the offending animal is warned, and it now becomes obligated after a span spread out over 3 days. Surely when the animal acts more aggressively by on a single day attacking 3 times, it's proving it even more habitually aggressive. Do you see how the kol v'chomer argument works?
Yeah.
Rabbi Meir. So, Kev, do you want to explain it to me? Just to see how to explain it, okay?
What about the more, so every time it goes, it becomes more aggressive, and it's nature.
What we're saying is we are saying that, but what we're saying is something slightly in addition to what you're saying. So Kevin's right in that every time an animal goes, it's now establishing its nature for aggression. But according to Rav Yehudah, it would have to show a pattern over a longer period of time in order to show that habitual aggressive nature has been entrenched into the animal's behavior. In other words, it's a daily habit. Whereas as far as Rabbi Meir is concerned, you could say the converse. If an animal acts aggressively on 3 completely separate days, now we're not saying, by the way, that those days are sequential. We're not saying on the Monday the animal did this, on the Tuesday it did that, on the 3rd day it did another goring. We could be talking maybe on over a period of a year, it does it 3 times. It says on 3 separate days. The point I want to emphasize is the word separate. It's not saying consecutive days. So Rabbi Yehudah said, if it's showing an aggressive pattern, say over a period of a year, where it does it 3 times, then that animal is now considered a dangerous animal. And Rabbi Meir is saying no. It has to be relatively closer in span, because what shows an aggressive animal more? And an animal that goes and goes crazy 3 times in one session, in 1 day, or over 3 separate days over a period of time. So Rabbi Meir wants to make a kol v'chomer and say, surely in a shorter intervals, when the animal is more aggressive, that shows it's even more aggressive than over a wider period of time with separate days and breaks between those days. Do you see Rabbi Meir's argument? That's what I want you guys to see.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
I do see it, but I just want to make a comment.
Yeah, sure.
Is that is that I agree with the shorter period. It does make sense, but on one day, to me, it's slightly problematic. This is my own personal opinion. We'll see now what the answers are. But the reason why I say that, if it all happens in one day, you could just be having a really bad day. You know, so that's the problem where it's all on one day. I think if it happens over a year, it's so spread out. That is also problematic. So I think a closer period is important. It does show more animosity from the animal side or aggressiveness, without a doubt, if it's closer. But one day is problematic to me.
Okay, so Gavin's 2 points to me, I think, are completely relevant. I think his first point is that I know if for example, my blood sugar's low and I've had 2 hours worth of sleep, I'm going to be irritable with everybody I see. It's just, you've caught me on a rotten day. If you've got flu and you're not feeling well and you're sleep deprived and you've just maybe you had shocking news that morning and your nerves are shot and you're not feeling well, or you had shocking news the night before, let's just say the night before, and you have hardly slept. You know, you've broken up with somebody you love, or your business has gone up the creek, and that previous night you slept for an hour at the most, solid sleep, you were worried, you were sleep deprived. The next day it hasn't resolved itself, and some idiot just behaves badly and you react badly, and that whole day you're generally not yourself and you've got very little tolerance for stupidity. In that case, I would agree with Gavin that you could be having a really off day. So it would be problematic. To address Gavin's point, by the way, guys, do you agree? I think it's a valid point, to be honest. But Rabbi Meir is saying the same remedy is the same thing that gives the cure. So Rabbi Meir is in fact agreeing with you, Gav, or you're agreeing with Rabbi Meir, because he turns around and says, if an animal desists from the same behavior even once, it reverts back to being a tum.
Sure, that's even more powerful.
Yeah, which means, in a way, it's a bit like Rav Yehudah. Rav Yehudah is saying, if it did the occurrence on 3 separate days to become muad, it then calms itself on 3 separate occasions, tested in the same conditions, it reverts back to being a tame animal. And Rabbi Meir said, if it creates 3 different occurrences on one day, and it only on the stops, reverts back from that aggressive behavior in the same situation on one time, we're even lenient. It's not even 3 times in one day, because I think he does recognize what Gavin's saying, because maybe that animal won't flip out or have 3 separate incidents on one day where that restitution would exactly mirror the same problem that caused the problem. In other words, he might not, that animal, so if that animal has 2 good incidents on that one day, it's not going to rectify 3 bad incidents on one day. So in other words, it's a much more, Rabbi Meir's thing is you have to do 3 really bad incidents on one day, whereas he says in order to remedy it, you only have to desist, your animal has to desist once on a given day, which means he recognizes Gavin's issue, and he's saying it's not even that the way to fix it up, where the animal would have to be calm on 3 separate times in one day, because that occurrence might not occur again. So Gav, that's a valid point. And then obviously mentions children poking at it, because children teasing it would obviously be more of a test than human beings, although nobody's saying you test children like that, but we're saying if we notice it. And then Gavin's second point, which I thought was very valid, was when he's saying, well, what if it's spread out? In other words, what is the statute of limitations in the amount of time that we consider an animal muad? Is it 12 months? Is it 5 years? When we say 3 incidents on separate days, over how long? In other words, the longer the period of time, the less aggressive the animal tends to be. Does that make sense? Which is obviously a point for Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir is saying at shorter intervals, it seems to indicate more aggression. And his obvious final case of the Kol V'chomer is saying, imagine if on 3 separate days over a period of time as the animal is aggressive, surely 3 times in one day it proves it's even more aggressive. I think Gavin's point was good in that it might have just been having an off day, but let's assume it's on 3 separate days. We need to still hit a Mishnah, and I need to speak to Rabbi Code to know how long is that period cutoff time. Is it a year? Is it 6 months? You can't almost, because they've got a concept in American law. What is that concept, Michael, where you do that third occurrence and you now get hit with all the other charges that you were put on probation for?
I don't know. I can't remember.
I don't know. Malcolm Gladwell mentions it in his book, that says that basically in the American law system, the court has leniency and they might give you a probation where you should have served a 2-year sentence, but you get 2 months of community service. And then you have a 5-year sentence and you do 6 months of jail time. But on your third offense, you now have all the other sentences being applied in its full capacity minus the time you've served. So because the third time is what there's a concept called a chazokah. So chazokah means that if you sit in a place and shul every day in the same place, that becomes your acquisition, so to speak. That after the third time you've acquired it, whether it's a bad habit, a good habit, or a particular activity. So chazokah means frequency of 3 or more times. So in that case, where do we develop this concept of chazokah? So just as a point in American law, they're saying if you're committing armed robbery the third time, it's no longer an act of desperation. That's your nature. So every bit of leniency that was given to you until that period of time, that leniency is taken away and you serve all those sentences concurrently. Meaning where you were given probation for good behavior, you now have to serve that full sentence, including previous sentences. Okay, that's why I think it's got one drawback, that particular law. I don't know if you've ever seen that when people are caught for armed robbery, you have these shootouts with police. Marco, have you seen it?
Yeah.
These American
The
cops.
ones
Yeah.
The ones who don't.
Yeah, well, why are they trying to shoot themselves out on the third time? Because they know all their previous sentences are now having to be served. So obviously, at the point where they're going to be arrested for their third offense, they're going to take as many people down with them as possible. And if you have a look statistically, when you have hostage situations that didn't start off as hostage situations, it's when people realize that they end up doing time for their third sentence and doing the time for all the previous offenses. All right, guys. So let me just tell you on where it's based on. So the sages say to Rabbi Meir as follows. So obviously Rabbi Meir says, if we're a bull spread it's scoring 3 times over 3 days, its owner is liable to the full damages of mu'at. Then, when it concentrates its scoring into a single day, is it not certain that he is liable to full damages? And the sages say to Rabbi Meir, let the Zava demonstrate the fallacy of your kal v'chomer. So basically the sages are turning around and saying, listen, we hear your kal v'chomer, but there's the fallacy. And where are we going to bring the fallacy from? The law of Zava. So you have a Zava, which is a woman who discharges uterine blood during the 11 days following her 7-day niddah period of normal menstruation. So if during this 11-day period, she discharges blood on just 1 or 2 consecutive days, she's tameh. But she can immerse herself in the mikveh to become tahor, pure, after observing only 1 clean day. In other words, 1 day without any discharge of blood. So such a woman is called basically what you call Zava Katana, which is a minor Zava, because she's able to rectify it with going into a mikveh and observing 1 clean day. But a woman who observes, if she discharges blood on 3 consecutive days during her 11 days of Ziva, she becomes a Zava Gedulah, which is a major Zava. And she must count 7 clean days before she may immerse herself in a mikveh. So in addition, she must bring a pair of bird offerings following her purification. So what we're saying here is the sages are saying that the kal v'chomer doesn't work. Because if you bring the point of a zava as an example, we're saying that consecutive days here seem to have a significance in terms of what is determined as a habit. And when there's a physiological habit of menstrual bleeding for 3 days after the what's meant to be the clean period post menstrual 7-day cycle, in that particular case, it's stating that it's not the number of discharges, because basically if she had 3 blood discharges in 1 day, but then obviously became a minor zava, and then would have to go to the mikveh that night and had a clean day the next day, she would be pure. So it didn't matter if she had 3 discharges on 1 day, as long as she had a clean day. But if she has 3 discharges over 3 consecutive days, she goes from a pure state to an impure state where she has to wait another 7 days to become pure. So the sages are saying we learn from this concept of a chazaka, or 3 consecutive days, from the laws of Zava, that in fact the number of days counts. It's not just the frequency of the event within a shorter space of time. Ironically, it's the opposite. It's a frequency over consecutive days that makes her a Zava Gadala, a major Zava, and she has to wait for 7 clean days before she can immerse herself again. Does that make sense? So that's the sage's argument against Rabbi Meir. It's Kol v'chomer. Right, guys, we're going to stop here. Any questions?
No,
Damon,
good.
So
Yeah.
I heard a talk, I'll be very quick because I've got to go in a minute.
Yeah.
That to change a shear, actually, to change a habit takes 40 days. I don't know if you've heard that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've heard even longer than that, but for sure 40 days. I've heard longer than that. But you know what? Exactly what Kevin's saying is that it's not the amount of times that you desist in a shorter frequency. It's in fact the opposite.